The first thing anyone should know about Elara Thorne is that she never made a sound when her heart broke. No gasp, no sob, no theatrical collapse that would have given her away. She simply stood outside the throne room doors, a wooden tray trembling in her hands, and listened to the vampire king, her mate, though he'd never acknowledged it, destroy her with 7 words spoken to make his courtiers laugh. She's suffocating. I can't breathe around her. The golden teacup she'd spent an hour selecting, the one with hand-painted forget-me-nots, because she'd noticed he paused fractionally longer when drinking from it, slipped from the tray. It fell in slow motion, spinning through the air like her heart spinning out of her chest, and shattered against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the corridor like a death knell. Inside the throne room, the laughter stopped. Elara Thorne, 24 years old, human woman bound by fate to an immortal king who found her devotion amusing, backed away from the doors. Her hands were bleeding from catching the tray's edge. She didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything except the sudden, merciful numbness that comes when pain exceeds the body's capacity to process it. She turned and walked away. Not ran. Walked. And she did not look back. What Elara didn't know, what she couldn't know as she disappeared into the servants' corridors, was that inside the throne room, Vampire King Lucian Ashgrave had gone absolutely still, his amber eyes fixed on the door where her shadow had just been. His enhanced hearing caught the sound of her footsteps, measured and deliberate, growing more distant with each passing second. And for the first time in his 900 years of existence, he felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with being undead. It felt like consequence. It felt like the beginning of the end. Acti, the bond he refused to acknowledge. 3 years earlier, the night fate made its choice. Lucian Ashgrave had not asked for a mate. In 9 centuries of existence, he had seen empires rise and crumble, witnessed the birth and death of stars, and learned that immortality's greatest curse was not boredom. It was the soul-deep loneliness that came from watching everything you might love turn to dust. So he had stopped loving. He'd built his court with precision, ruled the eastern territories with calculated coldness, and surrounded himself with vampires who understood that emotion was weakness. His castle, Nighthaven, was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture and frigid beauty, all obsidian spires and moonlit courtyards where warmth went to die. Then Elara Thorne walked into his great hall during the midwinter petitions, and the mate bond snapped in a place like a chain forged in starfire. Lucian felt it. Of course he felt it. The sudden awareness of her heartbeat, the way his dead heart tried to mirror its rhythm, the scent of her lavender and old books, and something uniquely, devastatingly her that made his fangs ache. The pull, the absolute certainty that this mortal woman with her ink-stained fingers and nervous smile was meant to be his. He'd looked at her across that crowded hall, and she'd looked back, and something passed between them. Recognition, terror, inevitability. Then Lucian did what he'd spent 9 centuries perfecting. He buried it. Elara had come to petition for her village, a small settlement on the edge of his territory that needed protection from rogue vampires. She'd stood before his throne in a simple brown dress, her dark hair braided with wildflowers, and spoken with quiet conviction about community and responsibility and hope. She'd been beautiful in the way of ordinary things suddenly illuminated, a candle flame in darkness, a bird singing at dawn. Lucian had granted her petition with a bored wave of his hand. Then he'd offered her a position in the castle, not because of the bond, never because of the bond, but because he needed someone to catalog his ancient library, and she mentioned she could read 4 languages, including Old Vampiric. Purely practical, purely professional. That's what he told himself. That's what he continued telling himself for 3 years while Elara Thorne worked in his castle, lived in his household, and slowly, inevitably, began to love him with the kind of quiet, patient devotion that terrified him more than any army. The devotion he took for granted. Elara learned his routines within the first month. Lucian took his blood wine at sunset, always in the West Tower study, where he reviewed territorial reports. She began bringing it to him herself, the crystal decanter warmed to precisely the temperature he preferred, though he'd never told her his preference. She simply observed and remembered. When he worked late into the night, she left a second decanter on his desk without announcement, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. He'd find fresh candles replaced before they guttered out. Documents he needed mysteriously appeared exactly when he needed them. At first, Lucian found it efficient. Then he found it comforting. Then he found it dangerous. Because Elara didn't just serve him, she saw him. She noticed when his shoulders tensed during difficult negotiations and later left a book of poetry on his desk, open to a page about perseverance. She observed that he avoided the East Wing on the anniversary of some long-ago tragedy and ensured that Wing's duties were handled by others on that day. When winter storms made him melancholy in ways he'd never admit, she began humming while she worked. Old human songs, simple and warm, that filled the silence he hadn't realized was suffocating him. "You don't need to do that," he told her once, his voice sharp. "Do what, my lord?" She'd looked up from organizing his correspondence, her gray eyes guileless. "Hover. Anticipate. Whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at the perfectly arranged study, the tea that had appeared without his asking, the shawl someone had draped over his chair because the room was cold and she'd noticed he'd been sitting rigidly. Vampires didn't feel cold, but he'd been holding tension in his shoulders for 3 days, and the shawl's weight somehow helped. "I'm simply doing my job," Elara had said quietly. "Your job is the library. My job is serving this household." Her voice remained gentle, but her gaze held his. "If I've overstepped, I apologize." She hadn't overstepped. That was the problem. Everything she did was appropriate, professional, perfectly within the bounds of her duties. But somehow it felt like more. It felt like care, that dangerous, mortal thing he'd spent centuries avoiding. Lucian had struggled for words, frustrated by his inability to articulate why her kindness felt like a threat. "Don't make it obvious." Something had flickered across her face then. Hurt, perhaps, or understanding. She nodded, gathered her things, and left. The next day, she'd brought his blood wine as always. But she'd stopped humming. Lucian told himself he preferred the silence. He was lying. The court that noticed what he refused to acknowledge. Lady Seraphine Blackwood had been part of Lucian's inner circle for 2 centuries. Beautiful, cunning, and ambitious, she'd long ago accepted that the king would never take a mate. His emotional unavailability was legendary. Then Elara Thorne arrived, and Seraphine watched with growing unease as her king began to soften. It was subtle, microscopic changes that only those who'd known him for decades might notice. He started taking meals in a library where Elara worked instead of alone in his chambers. He'd claim he wanted to review certain texts, but Seraphine saw how his gaze drifted to Elara's face when she was absorbed in translation work. He began asking Elara's opinion on territorial matters, framing them as hypothetical questions about human perspective. She'd answer thoughtfully, and he'd actually listen, implementing her suggestions while pretending they'd been his idea all along. When a visiting dignitary made a crude comment about the pretty little human, Lucian's response had been ice itself. The dignitary had left Night Haven within the hour, never to return. And most damning of all, Lucian had stopped feeding from the blood donors who came to court. He took only preserved blood wine now, and Seraphine suspected it was because he didn't want Elara to witness him feeding from another person's throat. The court began whispering. "The king is besotted. She's bewitched him somehow. How long before he acknowledges the bond?" Seraphine watched and calculated. A human mate would complicate everything. Elara had no political connections, no vampire allies, no understanding of court intrigue. She was a liability waiting to happen. And worse, she was kind. Seraphine had seen Elara give her own dinner to a young servant who'd been disciplined with hunger. Watched her spend hours teaching a deaf kitchen boy to read. Observe her care for ancient books like they were living things that deserved gentleness. That kind of goodness had no place in a vampire court. So Seraphine began to plant seeds. Casual observations to other nobles. Concerns about the king's distraction. Questions about whether Elara's influence might weaken his authority. She waited for the right moment to strike. It came during the winter solstice gathering. The breaking point, 7 words that destroyed everything. The winter solstice was Night Haven's grandest event, a gathering of vampire nobles from across the territories. Politics disguised as celebration, alliances forged and broken over crystal glasses of blood wine. Elara had been working in the library when the festivities began, carefully avoiding the grand ballroom. She knew her place. Servants observed from the shadows. They did not dance among the immortals. But at midnight, she'd been summoned to bring Lucian a specific treaty document he needed for a negotiation. She'd selected his favorite tea service, the gold one with forget-me-nots, and prepared chamomile because she'd noticed he was tense. The treaty she'd bookmarked at the relevant passages, knowing he'd appreciate the efficiency. It was care disguised as competence, love wrapped in professional courtesy. She approached the throne room, where Lucian held court with his inner circle. The doors were slightly ajar, music and laughter spilling into the corridor. Then she heard Seraphine's voice, crystal clear and poisoned with false concern. "My lord, forgive my frankness, but the court has noticed your attachment to the human librarian. Some worry it projects weakness." Elara's hand froze on the door handle. "Lady Seraphine." Lucian's voice was cold. "I have no attachments." "Of course not, your majesty. But the girl does seem rather devoted. Following you with those puppy eyes, constantly hovering, bringing you tea you never asked for." Laughter rippled through the assembled nobles. Elara felt her face burn. She should leave, should turn around and come back later. But she stayed, frozen, as Lord Ravencroft added jovially, "She's quite sweet on you, Lucian. Rather obvious about it. Perhaps you should clarify boundaries," another voice suggested, "before she develops inappropriate expectations." More laughter. Then Lucian spoke, and the world stopped. "You're not wrong." His tone was casual, almost bored. "She's suffocating. I can't breathe around her." The court erupted in cruel laughter. "Someone should inform her that devotion is only charming in moderation," Seraphine purred. "Perhaps assign her to the archives in the South Wing," Ravencroft suggested. "Somewhere she can pine from a proper distance. Or find her a husband in one of the villages someone else offered. Get her settled somewhere far from court." Lucian didn't disagree. He simply raised his glass in what might have been acknowledgement or dismissal, and changed the subject to territorial borders. Outside the doors, Elara Thorne stood perfectly still. The tea service trembled. The cup, the special one, the one with flowers she'd thought he liked, slipped and fell. The crash echoed like thunder. Inside, the laughter died. Elara looked down at the shattered porcelain, at the tea spreading across marble like spilled blood, at her own hands bleeding from catching the tray's edge. She felt nothing. That was the strangest part. The pain should have been devastating, soul-crushing, catastrophic. Instead, there was just silence. Empty, merciful silence where her love for Lucian Ashgrave had been burning for 3 years. The throne room doors opened. Lucian stood there, his amber eyes wide, his expression frozen in something that might have been horror or might have been nothing at all. Behind him, the court watched with varying degrees of interest and satisfaction. Elara met his gaze, and for the first time since the mate bond had snapped into place 3 years ago, she felt nothing when she looked at him. The pull was still there. Fate didn't release its chain so easily, but her response to it had simply stopped. "Forgive the disturbance, your majesty." Her voice was perfectly level. "I'll send someone to clean this." She bowed, proper, perfect, professional, and turned away. "Elara." Lucian's voice cracked on her name. She didn't stop walking. "Elara, wait." She turned the corner and disappeared into the servants' corridors, her bleeding hands leaving red prints on the stone walls. Behind her, she heard Seraphine's voice, saccharine with false sympathy. "Oh, dear. Perhaps we were too harsh. And Ravencroft, she'll recover. Humans always do." And Lucian, silence. Elara walked to her small chamber in the servants' wing, locked the door, and sat on her narrow bed. She looked at her bleeding palms, at the glass shards embedded in her skin that she should probably remove. Instead, she folded her hands carefully in her lap and stared at the wall. Tomorrow, she would bandage her hands. Tomorrow, she would return to her duties. Tomorrow, she would begin the rest of her life. But tonight, Elara Thorne mourned. Not with tears. Tears were too loud, too obvious, too much emotion for someone who just learned she was suffocating the person she loved most. Tonight, she mourned with silence. And silence, as Lucian Ashgrave would soon learn, was the most devastating response she could have chosen. Act 2. The silence that spoke volumes. Day 1. The first absence. Lucian didn't sleep that night. Vampires didn't require sleep the way mortals did, but he usually entered a meditative state at dawn, allowing his body and mind to rest. That morning, he remained in his study, staring at the door Elara had walked through the previous evening, replaying the sound of shattering porcelain and the look on her face. That terrible, blank look. He'd seen people break before, seen rage and tears and dramatic proclamations. But Elara had simply turned off, like a candle flame snuffed out. At sunset, he waited for her. She always brought his blood wine at sunset. For 3 years, she'd appeared in his study with perfect timing. The decanter warmed, a quiet greeting, and then she disappeared to continue her work. Sunset came and went. No Elara. Lucian told himself he was relieved. Clearly, she'd finally understood boundaries. This was better. Professional distance was appropriate. But his study felt cold. At dinner, he asked his steward casually, "Is Miss Thorne ill?" "No, Your Majesty." She completed her library duties today and retired to her quarters. She didn't seem upset. The steward's expression remained carefully neutral. "She seemed quite well, sire. Very composed." Composed. That word sat wrong in Lucian's chest. He returned to his study and found his blood wine waiting on the desk. The decanter was cold. Someone else had brought it, probably responding to his standing orders after Elara failed to appear. Lucian stared at the cold wine and felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. He ignored it and returned to his correspondence. Week 1. The Professional Ghost. Elara continued her duties with flawless efficiency. She arrived at the library each morning, cataloged texts, translated documents, and prepared reports. She attended meetings when summoned, standing quietly in the background and providing information when requested. She never brought Lucian his blood wine again. She never hummed while she worked. She never left books open to meaningful pages on his desk, never replaced his candles before they guttered, never appeared with that second decanter when he worked late. She was perfectly professional, and it was destroying him. By the 3rd day, Lucian found himself inventing reasons to visit the library. He'd claim he needed a specific text, and Elara would locate it within minutes, hand it to him with a respectful bow, and return her work. "Thank you, Elara," he'd say, searching her face for something. Anger, hurt, anything that indicated she still felt what she'd so obviously felt before. "Of course, Your Majesty." Her voice was pleasant, empty. Her gray eyes looked through him rather than at him. On the 5th day, he asked, "How are your hands healing?" She'd bandaged the cuts from the broken teacup, but he could smell the faint scent of blood beneath the linen. "Healing well, my lord. Thank you for your concern." Except there was no warmth in the gratitude. It was the same tone she used with everyone, courteous, distant, absolutely nothing personal. Lucian wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her, wanted to demand she yell at him, rage at him, give him something that proved she still cared. Instead, he said, "Good. That's good," and she returned to cataloging as if he weren't there. At night, Lucian found himself standing outside her chambers, listening to the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She slept deeply, dreamlessly. No crying, no restless turning, no signs of distress. It was as if she'd simply excised him from her emotional landscape. By the end of the 1st week, Seraphine approached him with a satisfied smile. "Well, that sorted itself out nicely. The human has clearly accepted her place." Lucian's hand tightened on his wine glass hard enough to crack it. "Yes, sorted. You should be relieved, my lord." She was becoming too familiar. "I said it's sorted, Seraphine." But it didn't feel sorted. It felt like something precious had slipped through his fingers, and he was only now realizing he'd been holding it all. Month 1. The desperate attempts began. Lucian tried gifts first. A rare book in Old Vampiric appeared on Elara's desk. a text she'd mentioned wanting to read months ago. He watched from the shadows as she discovered it, saw her fingers trace the leather binding with reverence. "Thank you for adding this to the library collection, Your Majesty," she said at their next meeting, her tone professionally pleased. "It will be invaluable for my translation work." She thought it was for the library, not for her. He tried again. A new writing desk appeared in the library's alcove where she worked, replacing the old scar table. It was carved from moonwood, expensive and beautiful. "The new desk is lovely," she remarked. "Very generous of you to invest in the library's infrastructure." Again, she saw it as institutional, not personal. Lucian began accidentally encountering her in corridors, creating opportunities for conversation. "Miss Thorne, I wanted your opinion on the negotiations with the Western Territories." "Of course, Your Majesty." She'd provide thorough, insightful analysis, then politely excuse herself the moment he finished questioning her. "I'm considering expanding the library. Your thoughts?" "I've prepared a proposal. I'll have it on your desk by morning." The proposal would appear detailed and professional, with no personal note, no warmth, nothing but competent work. He tried compliments. "Your translation work on the Ashbourne treaties was exceptional." "Thank you, sire. The library has never been better organized." "I appreciate your notice, my lord." Every response was courteous and completely impersonal. By the end of the first month, Lucian realized with growing horror that Elara had relegated him to the same category as every other noble in the castle. She was polite, respectful, and utterly unreachable. He caught himself one night, standing in the library at midnight, staring at the empty desk where she'd sat earlier, and realized he was waiting for the sound of her humming. The silence was suffocating. The irony of his own word choice nearly broke him. Month 6, the council notices. "Your Majesty seems distracted lately." Lord Ravencroft made the observation during a council meeting, his tone carefully neutral. Around the table, other nobles exchanged glances. Lucian had been staring at the door, waiting to see if Elara would bring the documents he'd requested. She'd sent them with a servant instead. "I'm perfectly focused, Ravencroft." "Of course. It's simply that you've rejected 3 territorial proposals that would have been advantageous. And you've been—" Ravencroft hesitated. "Shorter with the council than usual." Shorter? What Ravencroft meant was cruel. Lucian had been snapping at everyone, his temper fraying with each day that Elara remained pleasant and distant and absolutely unmoved by his existence. "The proposals were flawed," Lucian said coldly. 2 of them were drafted by Miss Thorne. Seraphine observed with false innocence. "I thought you valued her insights." He did. The proposals had been brilliant. He'd rejected them anyway because seeing her handwriting, her thoughtful analysis, her care for his kingdom that she no longer showed for him personally, it made him want to tear the documents apart. "This meeting is concluded." Lucian left before anyone could object, taking the corridors to the library where he knew Elara would be working. She was at her desk, bent over a translation, her dark hair falling forward. For a moment, she looked exactly as she had 3 years ago when the mate bond first snapped into place. Beautiful, absorbed, peaceful. Then she sensed his presence and looked up, and her expression became professionally pleasant. "Your Majesty, how may I assist you?" "I wanted to—" "What? What did he want?" "I wanted to discuss the territory proposals." "Certainly. Which aspects require clarification?" "Why did you recommend the alliance with the mountain clans?" Elara launched into a detailed explanation of trade routes, defensive advantages, and diplomatic opportunities. Her analysis was brilliant. She was brilliant, and she was explaining it the same way she might explain it to a stranger. "Thank you," Lucian interrupted. "That's sufficient. Is there anything else, my lord?" "Yes. Talk to me like you used to. Look at me like I matter. Sing while you work. Bring me tea I didn't ask for. Care about me again." "No, nothing else." She returned to her work, and he was dismissed. Lucian walked back to his study and stood at the window, staring out at the moonlit courtyard. Below, he could see Elara leaving the castle for her evening walk, something she'd started doing lately. She walked alone through the gardens, her pace measured and calm. She looked fine, completely, devastatingly fine without him. Year 1, the Breaking King. Lord Thaddeus Blackwood, Lucian's oldest friend and former battle companion, cornered him in the armory one evening. All right, enough. Lucian didn't look up from the sword he was sharpening, a sword that didn't need sharpening, but gave his hand something to do. Enough what? You've been unbearable for a year. The council is afraid of you. The servants are whispering, and you look like death. Thaddeus paused. More than usual, I mean. I'm fine. You're falling apart. Thaddeus pulled up a chair, straddling it backwards. I've known you for 6 centuries, Lucian. I watched you survive wars, betrayals, and the death of everyone you ever cared about. I've never seen you like this. I don't know what you mean. It's the human. Elara. Lucian's hand tightened on the sword hilt. She's your mate. Thaddeus said it matter-of-factly. I've suspected for years, but now I'm certain. And you drove her away. She's still here. Her body's here. Her heart left the night you called her suffocating in front of the entire court. Lucian flinched. You know I'm right, Thaddeus continued. You made a mistake, old friend. A catastrophic one. And now you're paying for it. She doesn't care anymore. The words tasted like ash. She looks at me like I'm nothing. Good. Lucian's head snapped up. She should, Thaddeus said firmly. You humiliated her. Dismissed her devotion like it was nothing. Why would she give you anything after that? I didn't mean. What you meant doesn't matter. What you said does. Thaddeus leaned forward. Here's the question. Do you want her back? Did he want this human woman who'd invaded his carefully controlled life, who'd made him feel things he'd sworn never to feel again, who'd cared for him with such gentle persistence that he'd panicked and lashed out? Yes. The word came out hoarse. God help me, yes. Then grovel. I'm a king. Then be a man first. Thaddeus stood. Apologize. Actually apologize. Not that half-ass if I offended you nonsense nobles do. Own what you did. And then give her time. I've given her a year. You've given her gifts and excuses and manufacture conversations. You haven't given her the one thing she deserves, your truth. Thaddeus headed for the door, then paused. She loved you, Lucian. Completely, courageously. And you threw it back in her face. If you want her to love you again, you need to prove you're worth the risk. The first real apology. Lucian found Elara in the garden at midnight, sitting on a stone bench beneath the silver willow. She came here often now, he'd learned. It was where she went when the castle felt too confining. He'd been watching from the shadows like a coward for weeks. Tonight, he stepped into the moonlight. Elara looked up, startled, then rose and bowed. Your Majesty, I didn't realize you'd be walking tonight. I'll return to my quarters. Don't. The word came out sharper than he intended. Please, I'd like to speak with you. Of course. She remained standing, her posture perfect, her expression polite. Lucian had rehearsed this conversation 100 times. Every version had sounded inadequate. I owe you an apology. That's not necessary, my lord. It is. He moved closer, stopping when he saw her shoulders tense. What I said during the winter solstice. About you being suffocating. It was cruel, thoughtless, and completely untrue. You were speaking honestly to your court. There's nothing to apologize for. I wasn't speaking honestly. The words rushed out. I was speaking out of fear. That got her attention. Her gray eyes finally focused on him, curious despite her careful distance. Fear, she repeated. You terrified me, Elara. Lucian's hands clenched at his sides. Everything you did, the care, the attention, the way you saw me instead of the crown, it was too much. Not because it was suffocating, but because I wanted it too much. She said nothing, just watched him with those steady eyes. I spent 9 centuries building walls, he continued, the words coming faster now, more desperate. I swore I'd never let anyone close enough to hurt me again. Then you arrived, and you didn't just scale those walls. You ignored them entirely. You cared for me like it was the easiest thing in the world. It was, she said quietly. The past tense felt like a blade. I know, and that's what terrified me. Because if loving me was easy for you, then losing you would destroy me. He stepped closer, watching her carefully for signs of retreat. So I pushed you away first. I said things I knew would hurt you, in front of people I knew would amplify the cruelty. You succeeded. I did. He forced himself to hold her gaze. And I've regretted it every moment since. Elara, you're apologizing because you feel guilty, she interrupted, her voice still eerily calm. Or because you miss the convenience of my service. But I need you to understand something, Your Majesty. She rose, and for the first time in a year, he saw emotion flicker across her face. Not love, not longing, something harder. I didn't care for you because I wanted something in return. I did it because I loved you. Not the king, not the legend, not the immortal you. The man who reads poetry at midnight and mourns losses from centuries ago. Who tries so hard to be cold, but can't help protecting the people under his rule. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I loved you completely, and you called it suffocating. I was wrong. You were honest. She cut him off again. Maybe not about your feelings, but about what you wanted. You wanted distance. So I gave it to you. I don't want distance anymore. That's unfortunate. Elara's smile was sad and final. Because I've learned to breathe better without you. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his, and headed back to the castle. Lucian stood frozen in the garden, her words echoing in his mind. I've learned to breathe better without you. It was the most devastating thing she could have said, because it meant she'd survived him. And survival, he was learning, looked a lot like moving on. Act 3. 3 years of patient devastation. Year 2, the quiet war. If year 1 was Lucian learning regret, year 2 was him learning desperation. He stopped being subtle. He reassigned Elara to work directly with him on territorial governance. She couldn't refuse. It was a promotion, a recognition of her skills. But it meant daily meetings in his study, forced proximity that made his chest ache and her expression remain professionally blank. The eastern provinces are reporting increased rogue activity, he'd say, spreading maps across his desk. I recommend increasing patrol frequency and establishing a rapid response unit, she'd reply, her finger tracing potential routes without ever touching his hand. What would you do, he asked, if you were in my position? I'd listen to my advisors and make the decision that best serves the kingdom. Always deflecting, always careful. One evening, as she gathered her papers to leave, he said, "Have dinner with me." She paused. "Your Majesty?" Not a command, a request. He tried for casual and failed miserably. "We could discuss the Northern Alliance proposal. I can provide my analysis in written form." "Elara, please." Something flickered in her eyes. Pain, perhaps, or memory. "Is there anything else you need for kingdom business, my lord?" "I need you to stop calling me that." "Calling you what?" "Your title. You used to call me Lucian. That was inappropriate. I've corrected the behavior." Corrected the behavior. Like her warmth, her care, her love had been a mistake to be fixed. "I didn't want you to correct it," he said quietly. "I wanted, with respect, what you want now doesn't change what you wanted then." She met his gaze steadily. "You made your preferences clear. I'm simply honoring them. My preferences have changed. Mine haven't." She bowed, that damn professional bow that killed him every time, and left. Lucian sat in the empty study and realized he was fighting a war he'd already lost. The letters he wrote but never sent. At night, alone in his chambers, Lucian began writing. "Elara, I don't know how to fix what I've broken. I've ruled kingdoms, negotiated with demons, survived centuries of immortality. But I don't know how to make you look at me the way you used to. I miss you. Not your service, not your efficiency, you. I miss the sound of your humming. I miss finding books open to pages you thought I needed to read. I miss the way you saw through all my walls and cared for me anyway. I miss being worthy of your care. I understand if you can't forgive me. I can't forgive myself. But I need you to know you were never suffocating. You were air, and I was too much of a coward to breathe. Yours, Lucian." He never sent it. Never sent any of the dozens of letters he wrote, each one more desperate than the last. Because letters could be dismissed. Words on paper couldn't show her the way his hands shook when she entered a room. Couldn't prove that he'd memorized the exact pattern of her breathing, the way her heartbeat quickened when she was excited about a discovery, the soft sound she made when she was thinking hard about a problem. Words couldn't show her that he'd spent 2 years becoming intimately acquainted with the shape of his own misery. The court's observation. He's obsessed, Lady Seraphine whispered to Lord Ravencroft during a council session. They watched as Lucian's gaze drifted toward the door for the third time, clearly waiting for Elara to arrive with the documents he'd requested. More than obsessed, Ravencroft murmured back. He's unraveling. It was true. The impeccable, controlled king was developing cracks. He snapped at nobles over minor infractions. He rejected perfectly good proposals if they came from anyone but Elara. He'd stopped attending social functions entirely, preferring to work late into the night, always finding excuses to keep Elara working late, too. Not to speak to her, just to be in the same room. This is your doing, Ravencroft said to Seraphine. You encouraged him to reject her. I encouraged appropriate boundaries, Seraphine hissed. How was I to know he'd become this? This being a vampire king who looked haunted, who'd lost weight despite not needing food, who stared at a human woman like she was the sun, and he'd been living in darkness for centuries. Perhaps you should apologize, Ravencroft suggested. To Miss Thorne. Smooth this over before he becomes completely unfit to rule. Seraphine had tried once, cornering Elara in the library. I wanted to apologize for my role in that unfortunate incident 2 years ago. Elara had looked up from her work, her expression pleasantly neutral. I don't recall any incident requiring your apology, Lady Seraphine. The winter solstice. When the king made those comments about you being, well, oh that. Elara returned to her cataloging. Ancient history. No apology necessary. You're very gracious. I'm practical. Elara's tone remained light. Dwelling on past hurts serves no purpose. I've moved on. Seraphine had reported this back to Ravencroft with frustration. She's over it. She's completely fine. Then why does she flinch every time someone says his name? It was barely perceptible, but Ravencroft had noticed. Whenever Lucian or the king came up in conversation, Elara's shoulders would tense infinitesimally. Her breathing would hitch. Her hands would still. Then she'd smooth her expression and continue whatever she was doing. She wasn't fine. She'd just gotten very, very good at pretending. Year 3, the desperate escalation. By year 3, Lucian had abandoned all pretense of dignity. He followed her. Not overtly, not in ways she could call out. But whenever Elara walked through the gardens, he'd find himself standing at his window, watching her path. When she worked late, he'd pace outside the library, listening to the sound of pages turning. He learned her routines intimately. Knew she took her morning tea in the kitchen garden. Knew she volunteered at the orphanage in the lower city every third Sunday. Knew she'd started keeping a journal that she wrote in before bed. He knew because he'd become pathetic enough to track her every movement like she was the only thing in his world that mattered. Because she was. One evening, Lord Thaddeus found him standing outside Elara's chambers again, just listening to her heartbeat. This has to stop. I know, Lucian said quietly. You're scaring the servants. I know. She's going to request a transfer. Asked to work at one of the outer estates. That made Lucian's head snap around. She's what? I heard it from the steward. She's been inquiring about positions elsewhere. Nothing definite yet, but Lucian, you're driving her away. I'm trying to win her back. You're stalking her. Thaddeus grabbed his friend's shoulder. Listen to me. This approach isn't working. You need to either let her go or change tactics entirely. What tactics? I've apologized. I've explained. I've given her time and space, and you've given her everything except the one thing that might actually matter. Thaddeus's expression softened. Vulnerability. Real vulnerability, not these careful conversations where you're still trying to maintain control. I've been vulnerable. You've been sorry. That's different. Thaddeus steered him away from Elara's door. Sorry is about you, your guilt, your regret, your feelings. Vulnerable is about her. About letting her see the truth of what losing her has done to you, even if that truth makes you pathetic. I can't. You can, and you will. Because if you don't, she's going to leave Night Haven, and you're going to spend the next few centuries of immortality knowing you had something precious and destroyed it with your pride. The breaking point when the king knelt. It happened on a Tuesday. Elara was working in the library, translating an ancient text about vampire-human bonds. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she'd learned to compartmentalize, to treat the bond between her and Lucian as an academic subject rather than a lived reality. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear him enter. Elara. She looked up to find Lucian standing in the middle of the library. No pretense of needing a book. No excuse about kingdom business. Just him, looking at her with an expression that made her chest tighten. Your Majesty, I didn't hear you come in. I need to tell you something. His voice was rough, unsteady, and I need you to just listen. Please. Something in his tone made her set down her quill. All right. Lucian moved closer, then stopped as if respecting an invisible barrier between them. When he spoke, the words came slowly, like each one cost him something vital. I haven't slept properly in 3 years. Elara blinked. Vampires don't need. I know, but I used to enter a meditative state, a kind of rest that kept me centered. I can't anymore, because when I close my eyes, all I can think about is the look on your face when you heard what I said. The absolute emptiness in your eyes when you turned away. He took a shaky breath, unnecessary for a vampire, but apparently his body was rebelling against his control. I've ruled for 9 centuries, survived wars, betrayals, losses that should have destroyed me. I've prided myself on never breaking, never bending, never showing weakness. His hands clenched at his sides. You broke me in 3 seconds. One look of nothing from you, and I shattered. Lucian, please, let me finish. He moved closer, and she saw that his hands were shaking. I told myself, I push you away to protect myself. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from something far more terrifying than loss. What's that? Love. The word fell between them like a stone into still water. You loved me, Elara. Completely, unconditionally. You saw every flaw, every cruelty, every frozen piece of my heart, and you loved me anyway. And I couldn't handle it. Tears burned in Elara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She cried enough for this man. So I destroyed it. Lucian continued, his voice breaking. I took the most precious thing anyone had ever given me, and I threw it away in front of an audience to prove I didn't need it. To prove I was still the cold king who needed nothing and no one. He sank to his knees. Elara's breath caught. A vampire king didn't kneel, didn't show submission, didn't make himself vulnerable to anyone. But Lucian knelt before her on the library floor, his head bowed, his entire body trembling with suppressed emotion. I was wrong. His voice was barely a whisper. I need you, Elara. Not your service, not your efficiency, you. The woman who hummed old songs and brought me tea I didn't ask for and saw me instead of my crown. I need you like I need blood to exist, and I'm drowning in your absence. Elara stood frozen, staring down at him. Part of her wanted to run. Part of her wanted to touch his face. All of her was terrified. I don't expect forgiveness, Lucian continued, still not looking up. I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you, not as your king, but as a man who spent 3 years learning that pride is worthless when you're alone. Please, give me a chance to prove I can be worthy of your care again. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Elara spoke, her voice thick with unshed tears. Look at me. Lucian raised his head. His amber eyes were bright with what might have been tears if vampires could cry. His face was raw with emotions he'd spent centuries hiding. He looked devastated. He looked human. I'm afraid, Elara whispered. I know. What you said hurt more than anything I've ever experienced. It made me feel small and pathetic and stupid for caring so much when you cared so little. I know. His voice broke. And I will spend the rest of my immortal life regretting that I made you feel that way. How do I know you won't do it again? The question came out small, vulnerable. How do I know that the moment I let myself care, you won't panic and push me away? You don't. Lucian's honesty was stark. I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I've spent 9 centuries building walls, and I don't know how to live without them. But I swear to you, Elara, I will try. Every single day. I will try to be brave enough to deserve your love. I don't love you anymore. The words should have been a relief, a clean break, but they came out cracked and uncertain. and both of them knew she was lying. Then let me earn it back. Lucian reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and took her hand. His fingers were cold against her warm skin, but his touch was achingly gentle. However long it takes. If it takes another 3 years, or 30, or 300, I'll wait. I'll be patient. I'll prove to you that I've changed. Elara looked down at their joined hands, at the vampire king kneeling before her, offering her everything he'd spent centuries refusing to give anyone. I need time, she said finally. You can have eternity. I need you to mean it. Not just now, while you're desperate, but tomorrow, and next month, and next year when the desperation fades. I'll mean it forever. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. Because you're not a phase I'm going through, or an obsession I'll recover from. You're my mate, Elara. The bond knew it 3 years ago. My heart finally caught up. She pulled her hand back, and he let her go immediately. If we do this, she said carefully, if I give you another chance, it has to be different. You can't hide from me. You can't use cruelty to push me away when you're scared. You have to let me in, actually let me in, even when it terrifies you. I will. And if you hurt me again, her voice hardened. If you make me feel like my love is a burden one more time, I'm gone. Not silent and distant, actually gone. Do you understand? Yes. Lucian remained on his knees, looking up at her like she was salvation and damnation wrapped in mortal skin. I understand. Elara studied him for a long moment, saw the desperation in his eyes, the trembling in his hands, the absolute collapse of every wall he'd ever built. She saw him. Finally, truly, she saw the man beneath the crown, broken and terrified and hopelessly in love with her. Stand up, she said softly. He did, slowly, like he was afraid sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. They stood facing each other in the library, surrounded by ancient texts and dust motes dancing in candlelight. The mate bond hummed between them, that eternal pull neither could escape. I'm not ready to forgive you yet, Elara said. I know. I'm not ready to love you again. I know, but... She took a shaky breath. I'm willing to try, to see if we can build something real instead of what we had before. What did we have before? I loved you, and you tolerated it. Her voice was sad but certain. That's not enough. If we do this, you have to love me back. Actually love me. Not just need me, or want me, or miss the convenience of my care. I do love you. Lucian's voice was fierce. I love you so much it feels like dying. Like every moment you're not close is a wound that won't heal. Then prove it. She stepped back, creating distance. Not with gifts, or grand gestures, or dramatic proclamations. Prove it by showing up every day and choosing me over your fear. Prove it by letting me see you be scared and uncertain and imperfect. I can do that. Can you? Can the great vampire King Lucian Ashgrave admit he doesn't have all the answers? That he needs someone? That he spent 3 years falling apart? I've spent 3 years in agony, he said bluntly. I snapped my counsel. I can't focus on governance. I stand outside your door at night just to hear you breathe. I've written hundreds of letters I'll never send. I've become pathetic and desperate and entirely undone. His laugh was bitter. Is that vulnerable enough for you? Tears finally spilled down Elara's cheeks. Yes. Then help me, Lucian whispered. Help me learn how to be human again. How to feel without fear. How to love you the way you deserve. Elara wiped her tears away roughly. This won't be easy. I know. I'm going to be guarded. I'm going to test you. I'm going to push back when you try to control things. Good. A faint smile crossed his face. I don't want easy. I want real. She studied him for another moment, then made her decision. Dinner. Tomorrow night. Not in the formal dining hall. Somewhere quiet where we can actually talk. I'll arrange it. And Lucian, she met his eyes. If we do this, we do it honestly. No more walls. No more pretending. If you're scared, you tell me. If I'm hurt, I tell you. We figure out together. Together, he repeated, like he was tasting the word for the first time in centuries. I can do that. Elara nodded and turned back to her work, effectively dismissing him. Lucian hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, to touch her, to close the distance between them. Instead, he bowed, a gesture of respect he'd never given her before. and left. As the library door closed behind him, Elara sat down at her desk and pressed her hands against her face. She was terrified. She was hopeful. She was giving the vampire king, who'd broken her heart, one chance to prove he'd learned how to breathe without pushing her away. And God help them both, she wanted him to succeed. Act 4. The Healing. The first dinner, learning to be real. Lucian arranged dinner in the castle's rarely used conservatory, a glass-roofed chamber filled with night-blooming flowers and soft candlelight. No servants, no formality, just a small table set for two. Elara arrived exactly on time, wearing a simple blue dress instead of her work clothes. She'd left her hair down, dark waves falling past her shoulders in a style he'd never seen before. She was breathtaking. "You look beautiful," he said, then immediately cursed himself. Too much. Too soon. Too desperate. But Elara smiled, small and cautious, but real. "Thank you. This is nice. The conservatory. You mentioned once that you miss seeing stars. The glass roof." He gestured upward where the moon was visible through ancient glass. "It's not quite the same, but it's perfect." They sat, and for several moments, silence stretched between them. Not the cold silence of the past 3 years, but the awkward quiet of two people trying to remember how to exist together. "I don't know how to do this," Lucian admitted finally. "Do what?" "Be casual, unguarded." He looked down at his hands. "For centuries, every interaction has been calculated. Every word measured for political impact. I don't know how to just talk to you without an agenda." "What do you want to talk about?" "Everything." The word burst out. "I want to know what you think about when you take your morning tea in the garden. Why you started volunteering at the orphanage. What you write in that journal you keep. I want to know you, Elara. Not as my employee or even as my mate. As a person." She tilted her head, considering him. "Why the orphanage specifically?" "Because you never mentioned it. I only found out because..." He stopped, realizing how it would sound. "Because you've been tracking my movements?" "Yes. No point in lying. I'm aware how that sounds. Obsessive? Slightly creepy. Both of those." He met her eyes. "I'm not proud of it." "Good. Self-awareness is a start." But her tone was almost teasing, and Lucian felt something in his chest unclench slightly. "The orphanage," Elara said, taking mercy on him. "I started going because one of the children, a little girl named Sophie, came to the castle with her guardian. She saw the library and asked if there were books about dragons. I gave her one to keep. That was kind. It was selfish." Elara's smile was sad. "After what you said, after the winter solstice, I felt worthless. Like my capacity to care was a flaw. But Sophie's face when I gave her that book." She shook her head. "It reminded me that kindness isn't a weakness. It's the most powerful thing I have." Lucian's throat tightened. "I made you doubt your own goodness. You made me doubt that it mattered." "That's different." They were quiet again. Then Lucian said, "I read philosophy at midnight. Usually in the East Tower where no one disturbs me." "I know. I mean," Elara flushed. "I used to notice the light on in that tower. You paid attention to my lights?" "I paid attention to everything about you." She said it simply, without embarrassment. "That's what love is. Noticing. Teach me." "What?" "How to notice." Lucian leaned forward. "I want to learn how to see you the way you saw me. To care the way you cared." Elara studied him carefully. "Tell me one thing you noticed about me this week. Not about my work, about me." He didn't hesitate. "You've started wearing a copper bracelet on your right wrist. It wasn't there before last month. And whenever you're thinking hard about something, you twist it." Her hand went to the bracelet unconsciously. "My grandmother's. I found in my old things. I wear it when I need to feel brave." "Why do you need to feel brave?" "Because I'm sitting across from a man who destroyed me once, giving him a chance to do it again." Her honesty was devastating. "That requires courage." "I won't." "You can't promise that," she interrupted gently. "You can only promise to try. So try. Show me you notice. Show me you care." So he did. "You hum different songs depending on your mood. Old folk songs when you're content. Religious hymns when you're anxious. You prefer tea to coffee but won't drink it if it's gone cold. You've worn a hole in the left elbow of your favorite work dress but won't replace it because your mother made it." He spoke quickly, afraid she'd stop him. You sneeze when you're around dust, but refuse to complain because you love old books too much. You're left-handed, but learn to write with your right because your childhood tutor insisted. And when you sleep, you curl up on your left side with one hand under your cheek. Elara's eyes widened. How do you know how I sleep? I stood outside your door too many nights to count. That's concerning. I know, but also... She bit her lip. Kinda touching. I'm a mess, Elara. The confession came out raw. I've spent 3 years becoming undone over you. I don't know if that's romantic or pathetic, but it's true. It's both. She reached across the table and touched his hand. The first time she'd initiated contact in 3 years. And it's a start. They talked for hours. About small things, favorite books, childhood memories, dreams they'd once had. And slowly, painfully, they began to build something new. Not what they'd had before, where she loved and he tolerated, but something real, something equal, something that might actually survive. Months of careful reconstruction. The next months were a delicate dance. Lucian learned to share what he was feeling. When council meetings frustrated him, instead of snapping at everyone, he found Elara and said, I need to vent. Can I have 10 minutes? She'd listen, offer perspective, and he'd feel lighter. When he caught himself falling into old patterns, try to control outcomes, building walls when he felt vulnerable, he'd force himself to name it. I'm getting scared. You're getting close again, and I want to push you away. I'm not going to, but I needed to tell you. And Elara, for her part, learned to trust again. She let him see her hurt when something he said landed wrong. That felt dismissive. I know you didn't mean it that way, but it hurt. He'd apologize. Actually apologize, not make excuses. She let him back into her routines slowly. He started taking his blood wine in the library again while she worked. No conversation required, just presence. She started humming again. The first time Lucian heard it, he froze. That old folk song she used to sing. His eyes burned with relief, so sharp it was almost pain. One evening, 6 months into their careful reconstruction, Elara brought him tea while he worked late. The golden cup with forget-me-nots. She set it on his desk without a word, then turned to leave. Stay, Lucian said quietly. She paused. Please, just sit with me while I finish this. So she did. She curled up in the reading chair by the fire, a book in her lap, occasionally humming those old songs while Lucian worked. It felt like home. It felt like healing. The night she said his name. It happened naturally, without ceremony. They were arguing about a diplomatic proposal, a genuine disagreement about strategy. Elara thought they should ally with the mountain clans. Lucian worried about overextension. You're being stubborn, she said, exasperated. I'm being careful. You're being paranoid, Lucian. His name. She'd use his name. Not Your Majesty or My Lord. Lucian, like she had before the world broke. They both froze. Elara looked panicked. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Say it again. What? My name. He moved closer, his eyes bright. Please, say it again. Lucian. Tentative, testing. Again. Lucian. Strong and now more certain. He pulled her close, not kissing her, just holding her against his chest like she was the only real thing in his entire immortal existence. I missed hearing you say my name, he whispered against her hair. I miss saying it. They stood like that for a long time, not solving their disagreement, not moving forward or backward, just holding each other and breathing. The mate bond acknowledged. 1 year after their first dinner, Lucian asked her to walk with him to the conservatory again. She came, curious but wary. I have something for you. He held out a small wooden box, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a ring, not gold or silver, but carved from moonwood, the same rare wood as the desk he'd given her years ago that she'd thought was for the library. It was always for you, he said, answering her unspoken question. The desk. Every gift. I just didn't have the courage to tell you. Elara touched the ring carefully. It was beautiful, simple, engraved with symbols she recognized from vampiric bonding ceremonies. I'm not asking you to marry me, Lucian said quickly. Not yet. I know we're not there yet. But I want you to know, I want everyone to know, that you're mine and I'm yours. That the mate bond isn't something I'm running from anymore. Lucian, you can say no. You could tell me it's too soon. You can. She kissed him. Their first kiss in 3 years. Soft and hesitant and tasting of salt from the tears on both their faces. When they broke apart, Elara whispered, "Yes. Yes. Yes, I'll wear your ring. Yes, I acknowledge the bond. Yes, I'm choosing you again." She smiled through her tears. Yes to all of it. Lucian slipped the ring on her finger with shaking hands. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant to be there. "I love you," he said. Simple, honest, terrifying. "I know." She touched his face gently. "I've always known, even when you didn't. I'm sorry it took me so long to catch up. You're here now. That's what matters." They stood in the conservatory under the stars, holding each other like they'd finally found their way home after years of being lost. Epilogue. The breath between heartbeats. 2 years later. The castle had changed. Music played in the corridors now. The servants smiled. The council meetings included more voices, Elara's especially, as Lucian had formally named her as his chief advisor. Not his mate. Not yet publicly. They were taking their time, building their foundation properly before making eternal promises. But everyone knew. The way Lucian looked at her made it obvious. One evening, Elara found him in the East Tower where he read philosophy at midnight. She brought tea, his favorite blend, perfectly warmed, and set it beside him. "Thank you," he said, pulling her down to sit beside him. "Of course. No, I mean," he turned to face her fully. "Thank you for giving me another chance, for teaching me how to be real, for not letting me hide. You did the work, Lucian. I just showed up. You did more than show up." He kissed her forehead. "You stayed, even when I didn't deserve it. We're past that now. No more apologizing for the past." "Agreed." He paused, then said, "I spoke to the council today, told them I plan to formally bond with you at the spring equinox." Elara's breath caught. "You did, if you'll have me. I know I asked once before with the ring, but a formal bonding." He looked nervous, actually nervous. "It's permanent, eternal. You'd be bound to me for whatever remains of my immortality. I know what it means." And she smiled, bright and certain and full of love. "And I've already spent years being bound to you by fate. Might as well make it official. That's a yes. That's a yes." She kissed him softly. "I choose you, Lucian Ashgrave. Walls and all. Today and forever." He pulled her close, and they sat together in the tower, watching stars through the window while tea cooled on the desk. Below them, the castle hummed with life. And for the first time in 9 centuries, Lucian Ashgrave felt like he could breathe. Not because Elara was suffocating him, but because she'd taught him that love wasn't about control or fear or perfect composure. Love was letting someone see your mess. Love was choosing them every day, even when it was scary. Love was humming old songs and bringing tea and noticing the small things. Love was being brave enough to say, "I need you," and meaning it. And love, real, lasting, devastating love, was worth every moment of the 3 years he'd spent in silence, learning that the absence of someone you love is the loudest sound in the world. Closing reflection. The castle staff would tell you that the vampire king changed after that night 3 years ago when a teacup shattered outside the throne room doors. They'd tell you he became softer, more human, but those who knew him best understood the truth. Lucian Ashgrave didn't change. He simply stopped hiding. And Elara Thorne didn't forgive easily, but she forgave completely. Because sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't rage or tears or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's silence, devastating, patient silence that makes someone realize exactly what they've lost. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, silence eventually breaks. Not with begging or grand gestures, but with a name spoken softly in the middle of an argument. With tea brought without asking. With choosing love over fear, one small, brave moment at a time. The king learned to breathe again. The maid learned to trust again. And together, they learned that some silences are meant to be broken, and some loves are worth 3 years of patience to rebuild.